Good morning, everyone, and welcome to another edition of CANTO Conversations. We've been told for many years that we should leave work at work, and when we're going to work, we should leave our home stresses at home. But that has literally changed overnight, as employees and their families have been catapulted into the world of remote work and homeschooling. The transition to remote work would have been a challenge under normal circumstances, but having to do that in the midst of a global pandemic has literally left families and organizations reeling. So what do we do now? For many of us, we are now working from our homes. But my question to you is, when does work end? When do you unwind? I mean, technically, you are physically still at work. What do we say to a colleague or an employee for whom home is not a safe place? Is the risk of intimate partner violence for those locked in with their perpetrators the organization's concern? Should we even care? Is it fair to expect toddlers to understand or even accept that mom or dad, who always greeted them with open arms and exclamations of joy, are now shooing them away constantly throughout the day while they sit in front of their own laptops and talk to strange people for more than 8 hours? How do we find a happy union for these formally opposing areas of life? In today's edition of CANTO Conversations, we ask, why should organizations even care about their employees' ability to manage the complexities of maintaining a healthy work-life balance? How can we as individuals who work from home successfully normalize our own work from home arrangements in a way that allows our loved ones to enjoy the best of what we have to offer while maintaining productivity levels for our own organizations? How can we achieve the right mix of working from home? Ladies and gentlemen, our speaker for today will help us answer these difficult questions and many more as she shares her advice on the pathways for sustaining healthy families and organizations. Mrs. Phyllis Reed Jarvis is the Chief Executive Officer of Ultimate Potentials, an internationally recognized organization vision-focused on being the providers and supporters of true work-life flow by removing the traditional divide between work and life. Phyllis is an experienced international executive coach who works with organizations and individuals across the globe, helping us to realize our full potentials. I am Krista Leith, your moderator for today. And in this edition of CANTO Conversations, I present to you the CEO of Ultimate Potentials, Mrs. Phyllis Reed Jarvis. Phyllis, welcome to CANTO Conversations.
Thank you, Krista. That's a great opening, great overview, and it's so true what you've highlighted. Before I actually get started, good morning, everyone, and thank you all for taking time out of your very busy days to join us in this conversation. I actually would like to thank CANTO, the CANTO team under the leadership of Ms. Teresa Wankin, for giving this opportunity for this particular type of topic. We know that it's not the normal CEO's perspective on the global pandemic that most folks have gotten used to in this forum. And yet it is a topic to which many organizations globally are turning much needed attention and resources. And so I say kudos to CANTO for really leading the charge in having this conversation, because again, my intention is that it serves as a catalyst for not just more conversations, definitely more, but also for actions, because there needs to be some actions taken. So again, thank you so much, CANTO, for allowing this topic to be part of your conversations. So we've spent about 25 years working with organizations on 3 out of the 5 continents. Had it not been for COVID, it would have been 4 out of the 5 continents. But, and you know, we've come to know that the foundation of any successful organization resides in really 2 key resources, and that's healthy families and healthy communities. And if we stop and think about it, our organizations, my organization, we hire employees. If I'm looking to hire someone, I will need to go fish from the pool of candidates that is in the community. And if that pool is not healthy, and that's where I am fishing or drawing my water from, should that pool not be healthy, it is going to transfer into organizations. And that's the point that I'm going to be making today regarding this very, very important topic. So it's a very simple agenda, 2 items. We're going to speak a little bit on helping employees navigate the crisis. Many of you who are leaders within your organizations, you've been doing quite a number of things for your employees to help them navigate. I'm just going to sort of go over a few of those. But where I'll place most of my emphasis today is on the pathways to recover and rebuild from crisis. And it's very interesting when we look at what people go through. And depending on the culture that we're in, we'll look at the challenges that folks are experiencing and we will name it, oh, they have issues, in that sort of tone of voice. But as the president of Color of Change, this is an organization based in the US that really, their work is around building sustainable equity within the American societies and of course societies globally. Rashad Robinson said, people don't experience issues, they experience life. And as Krista said in her opening, now that work and life have actually melded and have become one, we have a lot of unanswered questions in terms of, you know, where's the line, those lines of demarcation that we used to have when we would leave home and go to an office. Now we're either going downstairs or just walking across the hall. Children are still at home with us, spouses, extended families, and so on. So we have this experience of life, which is new. And how do we navigate all of this? There's one thing that we know for sure, is that crisis, such as this global pandemic that we're all experiencing, does not discriminate. Crisis is that common denominator of the human experience. And because of that, we need now to figure out how can we collectively bring some beauties, bring some I guess, semblance of order into this crisis that we're experiencing. So one of my colleagues, he's one of our consultants, he's also a musician, shared a beautiful story in regards to tension and crisis and the stress that comes from it. And the story is that when a guitar player replaces the string on his guitar, that instrument is actually rendered useless momentarily, temporarily. And it's not until the player starts to apply tension to that string, to the guitar as a whole, and the more tension that's applied, the right amount of tension that's applied, will bring what he describes, that discord, into music. And that's what we're experiencing right now. We have the tension, and it's getting tighter in terms of losses, job losses, loss of loved ones, the impact on, you know, just overall mental health and our general well-being. There's what's called right now the COVID-19 pounds. I'm not sure if anyone's heard of that, but that loosely translated is folks have stayed home and they're eating. And so these are things that we need to be aware of that can bring significant changes or discord to employees. That discord does not just stay in the home. it is transferred or translated into the workspace as well. And so there are many good things that have come out of COVID, one of which is most people have gotten used to us meeting and gathering in mediums such as this. I want to turn and look at some work that there's a quotation on the opening slide where David Kessler, who's a known expert on grief, his charge or his challenge to leaders in organizations is that they need to become deeply aware and mindful of how people are experiencing grief. And they need to create that space so that folks can indeed go through that grief. And so David Kessler in his work has actually identified 3 groups of people. One of the groups he refers to as the worried well, and the second, the affected, third, the bereaved. Just a little bit on each. The worried well are those who they've not been affected by the pandemic in terms of any illness. There's no one that they know or who's close enough to them who's experienced any sickness around them. And yet they are concerned because they are grieving losses as well. Loss of work, loss of that sense of normalcy, of opportunities and events. They're also maybe grieving the loss of work projects that they might have been passionate about and were working on, but all that had to come to a halt or had to be significantly altered in terms of now having to work remotely. They may be grieving loss of events in terms of weddings, graduations. So about 3 weeks or so, I attended the graduation of, I call her my daughter, but she's one of my best friend's daughter, who graduated from university. Very incredible and amazing accomplishment. And yet I was sitting on my computer in this same space. Parents were at home on their computers, watching her name and the names of hundreds of other graduates being called and their photos placed on our screen. We couldn't be in the physical space to celebrate with them. And so again, when we look at all these, David Kessler in his work dubs them all as being legitimate losses that create grief. And that again, leaders within organizations do need to make space to allow folks to actually move through this grieving process. The second group, the affected, they themselves were sick or a close family member was sick or close friend, but they have either recovered or they know that they will recover. So they've experienced trauma, they've experienced crisis. And again, where leaders are being called to be on the ready is that accommodation needs to happen and validation needs to happen. These folks may need counseling and they may need coaching and other forms of support in order to, again, help them go through the grieving process. Because that fear of being sick and any sort of negative ramifications or sort of fallout has them somewhat worried on top of being affected. And then the third group that he referred to is that they have lost a loved one. And again, as I said, we do have clients on 3 out of 5 continents. And I know from each of those sets of clients that a coworker has lost a family member due to the pandemic or a close friend. And again, this is an impact on these folks. So they're grieving a death and will be dealing with the 5 stages of grief. Many of you are familiar with Elizabeth Kubler-Ross's 5 stages of grief. And we know that at the end of it all is that we come to acceptance. So again, leaders need to be aware, deeply, deeply aware that many of these folks right now are far from that stage of acceptance. And that also not everyone goes through those 5 stages in a linear way. We can yo-yo, we can go across, up, down, and it's very different for all of us. So it's very important for us to be aware of what we call these three groups of people, because they are in your organizations. Now, we know that it's sources of stress that will either spiral us into being in one of these three groups. So let's take a quick look at 5 key sources of stress. So in putting together the Pathways for Sustaining Healthy Families and Organizations program, the research that my colleagues and I came upon, we identified these 5 key sources. Relationships, whether it's relationships in the workplace, as well as in the home and in the community. They're relationships and they have an impact on us. Changes in domestic situation, I'll look at that in a short while. Grief and loss experiences, I think you're getting a sense of what that is right now. Mental health and addictions are also key sources of stress, and they are exacerbated by global situations like what we're going through, the global pandemic, the increase in global racial unrests, and so on. And of course, health concerns, which pre-COVID might have been there, but now with the COVID pandemic, there's heightened needs, concerns, and worries. So these are the 5 key sources of stress that we've identified. And let's take a peek at the changes in domestic situation. So again, when we look at changes in domestic situation, there's some interesting data that's out there. One of which is looking at divorce. So in my part of the world that I am in, and again, I've seen that this is happening fairly globally, but at different levels. There's a backlog in the courts right now for of divorce petitions. So people have filed for divorce. And there's a slide I'll show you coming up shortly that explains why. So that's one of the major changes in domestic situations: divorce, separation, and so on. Of course, having children is a source of stress, good stress and not so good stress, depending on the stage where children are at. And I've seen with my clients when we're doing one-on-one coaching sessions, you know, they tend to apologize. I'm so sorry, Phyllis, because there's a toddler or a little school age saying, Mommy, I finished this reading. What do I do next? And they're apologizes. And I'm saying, please don't. This is the new norm. And we all are truly in this together. It's just not a hashtag statement. We're in this together. Right? And so I said, take your time and go and address. Sometimes I've invited them to just bring the child, have the child on their lap, and continue on with the session, right? That's accommodation. And it's also validating that this is real. Work still has to happen, but I'm still mom, I'm still dad, and it just has to happen. Blended families is another source. Abusive relationships. There's a recent article in one of the magazines that I subscribe to, where they talk about an increase in abuse within the family setting, that severe crimes such as murder and rape, they've actually gone down globally, but that there's a rise in the incidence of domestic family violence and abuse, as well as increased use in substances, alcohol, drugs, and such. And there's loss or change of employment and retirement. So the slide that I have on the screen here, we show the 2 arrows kind of going back and forth because they morph into each other and impact on the domestic situation, which we now know what happens at home, as Krista said in her opening. You know, historically, we were encouraged very strongly, don't take home to work, don't take work home. But right now, as I said, the two have melded and blended, and we're seeing the impact. And again, if organizations are truly aspiring to be best employer, best in their industry, and attract the best talent, they need to, again, not only make the accommodations, but to validate that these impacts of crisis are very real on people, on communities, and consequently on their organizations. So just moving ahead, I compiled a little bit of data looking at the unemployment rates Another major impact on the domestic situation. This is a fairly global take. North Africa is an exception in terms of unemployment rate, and it has its own reasons, which I won't go into right now, but you can see most of the countries around the world, if you hone in on Latin America and the Caribbean, this is where my mouse is here, fairly stable in 2019 and somewhat in 2020, but rising. And the majority of these countries, there's a prediction for an increase in unemployment rates. Again, a role there for organizations, a role for communities and the various community leaders to play in helping to mitigate the impact that these types of crisis situations can and do bring on families. I'd mentioned the increase in the backlog of our courts of divorce petitions. And again, this is from a quotation from a divorce lawyer who is saying very rightly, folks just don't have the communication and empathy skills required to spend 24/7 with each other. On top of that, they're teachers and they are their own, whatever their roles are in their companies, they're still mom, they're still dad, and so on. So you need to have certain emotional intelligence skills to help navigate through these crises. And again, I see that as an opportunity for organizations to step up and help accommodate and validate what folks are feeling. Typically for many individuals, I've been doing this work for 28 years now in just different capacities. And I have seen and I know work has often been used as an escape for many. At least they would have 8 to 10 hours outside of the home. And in her opening remarks, Krista mentioned, what if there's situations of abuse? At least you know you're escaping that for 8 to 10 hours. Not so for a significant proportion of individuals who are now working at home. In fact, we know of some companies, a few in Jamaica's come to mind, where 70% of their workforce are now working from home. So these are real situations, real impacts of the crisis that we can't just say, oh, it's great, I can go to work in my pajamas, or I can, work when I want to. There are other effects of the crisis that we need to be looking at. And that takes us to now the question that we've been asking organizations, our company's been asking organizations, what are the structural and systemic changes that they as organizations will need to make, as well as communities, in order to sustainably rebuild and recover from crisis? Our answer comes from we believe that it's a three pathway approach. And I'm going to share those with you fairly quickly. These are the three pathways. I have a strong background in public health, and I understand right now most of us have been exposed to the principles of public health, the physical distancing, the need for hand washing. Don't touch your face, don't touch your face. If you're showing these symptoms, stay home or don't go out and so on. Those are all some of the basic principles of public health. I want to take those principles and apply them into how organizations and communities now can sustain families so that communities can evolve to become healthier, and consequently organizations will become healthier. Education of the masses, we've seen an excellent example of that public health approach, and then a commitment to building healthy communities. And this is really a charge that I am putting out to organizations for them to become stronger corporate, captains or champions of corporate social responsibilities. And how do you go about doing that? So let's take a look at a couple of the actual execution strategies that we've identified. So under the public health approach, I see that as looking within organizations and now within the family setting where the organizations are. How do you maintain the psychological health and safety of your employees and their families? Under education of the masses is engagement, and for healthy communities, committing to building sustainable, healthy communities, we see that as ongoing coaching and development. Now, we might want to take a peek at what does it look like for psychological health and safety. I have 4 key areas here that extensive research has been done over the years. This research comes out of the, they used to be called Great West Life company, they're now called Canada Life, and they've looked extensively at what are the key factors that impact employees and consequently communities' health and well-being. And one of the factors has to do with the way work occurs. And so this is one out of 13 factors that they've identified. So we look at work deadlines, workload, work method, and how work occurs. Now that we've morphed into having work at home, and we're also, as I said earlier, teachers, and we are, nurses and so on, attending to our families and their needs, as well as our regular jobs, that's where we need the flexibility. And in the opening where David Kessler talked about the need for leaders to accommodate and to validate, it couldn't be any stronger or even more needed than in these settings. So if you look at workload, I know I've had sessions with senior leaders, with middle-level managers, and one of their concerns is that I don't know if they're putting in the hours, Phyllis, that they're being paid for. And I probed a little bit and I said, what do you mean by that? Well, are they giving us the full 8 hours that we're paying them for? And it's an interesting question that he's asked, simply because when these same folks were putting in 10 or 12 hours at work, I did not hear them say, John, Mary, you should go home because we're paying you for 8 and you're now going into 10, 12 hours. So those are some of the concerns that some of the leaders are putting towards us as we work with them as their executive coaches. And then we're hearing from employees the same, right? The days are longer, they're working harder, the day and night are melding into one. So we need to look at these 4. I won't go into too much detail into each, but would really entertain some questions that you might have regarding each of these particular factors that impact work. And then very quickly, engagement. Right now, pre-COVID, the global employee engagement rate was disengagement rate. I'll give you the disengagement rate first. So globally, 85% of employees are disengaged, don't like work, don't really want to go to work, do show up because there is a paycheck to get for many, and they literally fly under the radar. That now leaves 15% of employees who are engaged. Within this 15%, remember now we're going to bring, say, 70% of folks to work from home. There are serious considerations that organizations need to take into place, one of which is how do we retain the organizational culture now that they're at home, right? And if folks were initially disengaged, now that they're at home, you're not seeing them as a supervisor and as a leader. There's studies, again, that's been done that show 91% of workers at companies with leaders that support well-being efforts, they are more motivated and they do their best at their jobs. There's also research that show there's an 11% higher revenue per employer. So any of those employers who put these wellness initiatives in place, those accommodations and validation measures, 11% higher revenue. And they notice there's 1.8 fewer days absent per employee per year. That translates into revenues for organizations. And finally, they noticed that with health and productivity improvements, when those are put in place and considerations are given, there's a 28% greater shareholder return. So very quickly, I want to take about maybe 4 to 5 minutes. I know it's about 9:30, but I want to run into looking now at attracting and retaining the best talent. And I want to talk about the next generation of employees. And they are a very specific and unique group of young men and women. So the Coles Notes version of what they want from work comes down to this, is that they want ongoing coaching versus just, you know, every year I am just getting this annual performance reviews. And I'm hoping that those who are in this webinar recognize, if you're doing performance reviews once a year, that the recommendation, and most companies globally have moved in this direction, they must be ongoing. They should be monthly, bi-monthly check-ins, and you're documenting what you've discussed, and you compile and you just do that coaching and development throughout the year, so that when you do come to that final meeting with your direct report, you have compiled their progress over the year. And both of you, none of what's going to be said in that final session will come as a surprise, because you've had ongoing coaching. They want a boss who is also a coach versus just a boss. And again, feel free to ask questions around that. They're looking for opportunity for growth and development, and they're big on work-life balance. In fact, there's beautiful, powerful Gallup polls that show us that the next generation of employees are the most underemployed, because they will choose a job that fulfills these 5 criteria versus one that's paying them more, but they have terrible work-life balance. And if as a company, as an organization, you don't know what they want, you will lose out on very valuable talent. And again, they want to be in a company where they're proud to say, that's the company I work for. And of course, the quality of their manager and quality of management is key for their retention. And I believe it was Ariana Huffington in one of her posts that said, folks, employees don't leave companies, they leave managers. They leave managers. And that is so true. So what do employers need to know about this next generation of employees? Well, there are 4 questions that employers do need to answer. And the first one here is, can you clearly demonstrate to this next generation of employees that your organization will be one that they can be proud to work for? And again, there are multiple criteria that needs to be considered. You also need, as an employer, as an organization, to demonstrate how you can help them grow and develop. You also need to demonstrate to them how well people are treated, both economically and interpersonally. And again, when you look at racial tensions, and it exists everywhere, it's right there in the Caribbean, classism, and so on. As folks are coming up, this new generation, they're starting to recognize some of those barriers, structural and systemic barriers, do need to be broken down. And they want to know, how well are people treated, not just financially, but interpersonally. And finally, the question that organizations need to answer is that, is the work itself fulfilling and enjoyable? And we're not talking about having ping pong tables put into your workplace, bringing in snacks and so on. You know what, that's okay. These folks, they want more than that. And so as a way of summarizing, I just want to stress that we need to look at multiple pathways that we can address the impact of crisis. That a public health, the principles of public health have been shown to be very, very effective when applied to organizations, when the right kind of education is applied. And also that commitment from organizations that they know where they're getting their people, where they're bringing in the talent is from communities, and that they need to have that connection with communities in order to identify priorities and agree on key priorities that will help folks manage and navigate their way through this impact. So that's my brief overview for today. I welcome any questions or comments that you might have.
So thank you, Phyllis, for that very insightful presentation. I have a number of questions, and I'm going to take one from the audience shortly. But first, I want to speak about this issue of the increase in domestic violence for those of us working from at home. So we have a Dutch newspaper, this one, 2020, which reports how a teacher was physically attacked, presumably by her partner, while she was video conferencing with her class. The Guardian 2020 reports about the surge in domestic violence in relation to COVID-19 in the United States. And we have the Secretary General of the UN, who called on governments to put women's safety first as we, in fact, respond to the global pandemic. I've recognized what for me is a disturbing trend. The focus has been on protecting women solely. Not that women don't need to be protected, but the assumption there is that the male is the perpetrator at home, when in some instances that is not necessarily the case. Should we be concerned about the apparent silence of the rise in domestic violence directed toward men? Are we doing enough? Should we do more?
And the question is specifically, should we be doing more for men regarding domestic violence? Absolutely. In fact, it's a pet peeve of mine. Most programs are directed towards women, and rightly so, because historically women have often been left out of the conversations, and as a result have sort of been behind. But most of the programs now are geared towards developing and equipping women, which is needed, and I absolutely agree. My concern is when you leave the men out, we're still leaving a gaping hole. It's a massive gap that's being left. So we believe, notice the topic today is pathways for sustaining healthy families. That comprises everyone. And so it is very concerning, and I believe that when we teach, coach, train the requisite communication and empathy type skills to both men and women, we can better level the field. And again, it's a public health principle. If we all work to flatten the curve for COVID-19 with key practices, and that's how the curve has been able to be leveled. Well, we can level the curve for domestic violence by ensuring that both men and women are learning the same tools, they're receiving the tools, and they're knowing and learning how to apply these tools so that they can have these conversations at a higher emotional intelligence level versus having the woman who is equipped, very knowledgeable, and then if you're in a culture that is fairly kind of a macho type culture, that's intimidation. So all we're doing is setting up women to be more victims of violence because of their increased knowledge. We need to raise the two up so that we have indeed flattened that curve and can better start building healthy, sustainable communities.
Thank you, Phyllis. So while we're on the topic of public health, there's a question from our audience that I would like to take at this point in time. Nicole wants to know, doesn't the public health approach mean that more resources, both human and financial, be made available to effectively address the scourge of sexual and domestic violence, which includes child and sexual abuse?
Absolutely, we need the resources to be put in place. And I see it as a three-pronged approach. If you notice throughout my presentation, I've always charged leaders within organizations, because organizations are, as I say, they're drinking from the pool that the abused women, abused children, abused men are also drinking from. And if that pool is dirty, then that's what's going into organization. So one way in which to mitigate the impact on the cost of resources is that we, as leaders in organizations, take a more of a social approach, community social development approach, and we partner with community leaders, so grassroots leaders. We partner also with government agencies. So we take that three-pronged approach so that the resources and the needs and demands on our budgets can actually be shared. So absolutely, we will need more resources and more needs to be put in. But it's a three-pronged approach that I see coming.
Thank you, Phyllis. So for a number of us, we celebrated working from home. So I, for example, I'm quite happy to be working from home.
Oh, my.
There are a number of things that I didn't consider as a manager. So I had employees saying to me, you know, Krista, while we're in meetings, the little one is asking me for a snack every 5 minutes. I had other employees shouting at their children who weren't paying attention while they were being, you know, told by their teachers across the internet. And I also have staff who, in one instance, they're caring for elderly parents and one who has a specially able child. Mm-hmm. So my question is, how do we set realistic and compassionate expectations, not just for ourselves, but for our co-workers, for those we manage, and as well for our own families? Is there a formula for doing this? Are there some tips that we need to consider, or is it all just trial and error?
You know what, it's not necessarily trial and error. There are strategies that's available. So I was in a webinar just yesterday that was put on by Sun Life Insurance. It's a Canadian-based insurance company. You actually can access their website. There's just incredible resources that they've made available for individuals to address some of these very questions that you've posed. So one of the things as managers, leaders, supervisors, anyone that's managing people need to be doing at this time is called the check-in. And if there's anyone in this webinar who's ever done work with us, we typically have trained leaders in baseline coaching techniques. So if you can call your employees and set it up where you have regular ongoing check-ins, remember that's what the next generation of employees are saying that they want and need. They want ongoing coaching. So if you have that ongoing conversation with them, they will become used to it, and it's not a stressful event when it's time to come and see you. During these check-ins, not only do we address work, but we also need to seek permission. Hey, Phyllis, I know that you're at home. I know you have 2 young kids. They're in school. Would you mind? How are things going? Is there any way that I can give some support around the time that you will need to maybe help them online? Because while they're working with their teachers, it's typically regular work time as well. So you might need to leave a meeting temporarily because the Zoom has crashed or whatever it is. But if you're having those check-in meetings with your employees on a regular basis, you're going to build trust, you're going to build comfort, we call it presence, and they're going to feel that they can not only trust you, but that it's a safe space. So what David Kessler mentioned is that's accommodation. We need that conversation around what accommodations, if any, can I put in place, Phyllis, to make this period in life easier for you and for your children. Now, what the experts in family violence and so on encourage leaders to do is not to ask specifically, are you experiencing any abuse or any violence or so on, because that's probing into people's personal lives. So we don't go down that road. But what we can do is ask global questions. How are things for you? How are you managing working from home? What challenges, if any, are you facing that maybe we can work together to put some measures in place to help mitigate them? And then finally is knowing what the resources are that you can refer them to. And it's very important that some of these resources, you yourself as a leader, call, find out about them, ask what's the process, so that when you're referring or making any sort of recommendation to your employee, you're not saying, oh, I think there's this place that you can go. No, I have called so and so, and these are some of the questions they're likely to ask you, and this is the kind of work that they do. Would this be something you'd be interested in pursuing? And then finally, follow up. So don't just have that conversation with them, check your box and say, done, I've done my duty. No, follow-ups at the next ongoing coaching conversation. You want to segue any updates on how things are at home, right? Because they're working at home, and you have that right now to ask, how are things going in this new office space? And we spoke about a few things last time that you were challenged with, Phyllis. What, if any, improvements have you seen? What, if anything else, could we look at to help mitigate? So there's a process, and it's a 6-step that we use. It's a coaching process where you build that presence, you ask the question, you create the space, you help them come up with some solution, you help them identify what actions they'll take, and then you do your follow through, and follow up.
Thank you, Felix. There you have it, folks. Advice from the CEO of Ultimate Potentials. I have been taking notes. So yeah, it is inevitable that some organizations will in fact reopen their physical spaces. So we have a question from the audience, and we want to know what advice, or what are 3 things you would advise CEOs and COOs to focus on as offices reopen for business?
Great question, and I'm so glad it was asked. So I mentioned earlier in the presentation that, again, the work from David Kessler, where he talked about 3 groups of people, and he charged leaders that they need to be mindful of these 3 groups. So they're going to come into the organization, and leaders will need to know, how do we actually make the accommodation for them so that they can go through whatever process that they're going through. So again, it comes back to the last question that you've asked. We have to have the conversations with folks. There are many individuals who would be quite happy staying at home working, but because the office is open, they feel a sense of obligation that they should go, as opposed to raising it with their reporting manager and ask, is it possible for me to continue working from home? So we want to, as leaders, give that space so that we can have conversations as to who would be best suited to work in the physical space. Because, you know, really look at it. If they've been working at home for the last, 3-4 months, it means they can work from home. And for many, they're doing so quite effectively. And so, number 1 is the conversation. Be able to have them talk about having an option, whether it is a part-time or, 80-20, 60-40 home work, or 100% at home. And I have some thoughts on that. It's actually not recommended 100% from home. Their productivity level is pretty much the same as those who work 100% in an office space and hate it. So again, there's a sweet spot there. So that's number 1. So number 2 is recognizing within your own organization what built-in resources you have to manage them as they come back to a sense of normalcy. So is it through your HR department that you would have programmings that they can tap into, or is it through the regular ongoing coaching conversation that we'll be having with their own reporting managers? And number 3 is the third execution strategy that I shared, and is that overarching commitment to building healthy families and consequently healthy organizations. So how you as an organization, when you transition back into the physical workspace, what sorts of community practices, messaging, and so on you're sending out to the community regarding how are you keeping my mom, my dad, my brother, my sister, my uncle, etc. safe? Because even though they're back to work, folks are still left at home worrying, are they coming in contact with, say, someone who has the virus? So we need to have that community approach. We need to have the resources within the organization, and we need to have ongoing conversations.
Thank you, Phyllis. So I'm just going to segue using that last question a little bit. So you spoke about three groups of people earlier: the worried well, the bereaved, the affected. And I sat here and I was asking myself, sometimes our C and E levels in the organization actually fit into one of those groups, perhaps the bereaved. Do you think as executives in the organization, we are in fact doing enough for ourselves? Because we recognize that there is a duty of care to those under our purview. But sometimes I think we forget that our level, while we sit in the boardroom, you know, we too might need help. Do you think the organization and the executive team is doing enough to protect itself and to be healthy enough to offer the care that their own employees do in fact need?
To answer the question very quickly, no. So, and I see the evidence, not doing enough to protect themselves. They're not doing enough to model the requisite behavior that they are exposing to their employees. So they're talking the talk, but they're not walking the talk. And so, no, they're not doing enough. And so when you look at a senior leader who is sending emails to an employee way after hours, 10 at night, 11, 2 in the morning, etc. Guilty, right? And no caveat in that email saying, the idea just came to me, feel free to just respond tomorrow. So you just send it. Depending on the employee, they feel this deep sense of obligation. Not only should I be checking often because my boss sends me emails at all sorts of hours, right, the night, but that I have to respond to it right away. So one of the things I do in my company with my employees, I get insights and ideas at different times of the day and night, but I say at the very top, no need to respond to this now. Just sending it out there. We'll address it tomorrow, right? So if we're not setting the examples, for example, if you're working through lunch, so you're not stopping to eat, you have back-to-back meetings, and it's now worse with the screen. It's easier in the sense that you can connect quickly, but it's also worse because it really wears on the eyes, no matter who you are. So you have back-to-back meetings, and if you as the leader are not stopping and say, hey guys, you know what, my eyes are killing me. I'm gonna take a half-hour break. And I really encourage you to do the same. Take care of yourselves. So again, it's a matter of us walking the talk. And no, we're not doing enough as senior execs to take care of our own selves and to also model that behavior to our direct reports.
Thank you, Phyllis. Another question from the audience. How can women who predominantly head households, and I'm just going to stick my own flavor in there, and single dads, how can these individuals engage in a pathway to help them cope mentally with the pressures of raising children during these tough economic times when many have lost their incomes?
Absolutely, and that's a powerful question. So the stress, and again, that's an impact on the domestic situation, loss in income, and then the stresses of managing work, life, coping, etc. So how do you manage your mental health and well-being? The most important way we can start doing that is to talk about it. So I always equate mental health in many, many cultures. It's a bit more okay here where I live in North America than it is in the Caribbean. And I do a lot of work in the Caribbean and some Asian countries and so on. The tendency in, say, the Caribbean is to put it under, hide it, put it under the rug, you know, put it out of the way. We're not talking about it. It's not real, or it's just those people who are on the street. So the number one and most successful way that we can actually take care of our mental health is to talk about our mental health, is to talk about the fact that I am feeling overwhelmed. I feel anxious. I am feeling sad. My productivity level is down and I don't know why. You know, I'm suffering from malaise. I don't feel like, you know, I'm excited about anything anymore. Talk about it. And again, it comes back to leaders. So we don't pry because that's people's personal lives. Yet what we can do as leaders is recognize signs. And especially if things are sort of flowing into work. So what I have gathered in the data that we've used to put together the Pathways program is that you can see signs of problems either by low or severe underperformance or the hyper performer. So they're working above and beyond. Neither is good for that person nor the organization. So very quickly, you have to talk about it. Leaders need to be comfortable making sure that you're asking the global type of questions that will give an opening to that employee to say, actually, I have just been feeling really low, whatever it is that they're experiencing. Talk about it. Talk, talk, talk. You have to keep talking about it.
Thank you. So we're almost out of time, but I want to take one more question from the audience. So we recognize that this is the fourth industrial revolution and governments and policymakers are beginning to put things in place to support that: extra spectrum, more broadband, and the whole lot. But coaching and tangible employee care are not priorities, particularly in the CARICOM region. So we're taking care of the hard stuff, but not necessarily the soft stuff. What would you recommend to start the type of movement that is required to bring about the necessary change to deal with these softer issues from a policy perspective, from a government perspective?
Great question, and thank you so much for asking it. So again, it comes back to the three-pathway approach that I shared earlier. We have to use the principles of public health. Public health protects the health of all. It doesn't discriminate. And we have underneath public health, we have certain components. So there are 4 components that we can apply to address that question. One of which is strategic, sort of looking at those strategic priorities, both from a governmental, both from an organizational and from a community level. We also need to look at structural component. So how do we select priorities and how do we release them into communities within our organization? And of course, cultural. Every single organization has culture, and we need to look at our culture. Is it a culture that fosters the talking about the soft skills? Or is it a culture that looks down on the soft skills and see it as, oh, that's a female or a woman thing? Because there are organizations that do that. And so looking at your culture of your organization and of course the external culture itself, and say as leaders, how do we shift this? We need to change so that as we look at this 4th revolution that we're in, we are moving in tandem forward. And then the final one is technical. And again, it's a principle used in public health where you use data and you analyze the data and you can crunch that data to show you just how it impacts your top and bottom line revenues. And as a CEO of my organization, my top line revenues and my bottom line revenues are critical. And I know how I can improve those, and it's through my employees. And so we give them that space, that forum, so that they can talk about what's impacting them and put the appropriate resources in place.
Phyllis, thank you so much for that. So we're almost at the end of today's session. Actually, we're running out of time. So Phyllis, would you give us one takeaway that would be pretty useful for employees, employers, generally those on the forum today? One takeaway before we leave.
I think the one overarching takeaway is the importance to keep talking. So employees to talk with your leaders and your managers. So don't be afraid to approach them. And then leaders know the data show us that the next generation are not quick to come to you. So leaders, go to them. Find your people, have the ongoing coaching conversation with them, build that presence, build that, that relationship with them, because that's what the foundation of your organization is built on: healthy families and healthy communities. So keep talking. How do we be healthier as a community, healthier as an organization? Keep talking.
Thank you, Phyllis. So folks, you heard that from the CEO of Ultimate Potentials. Keep talking. We have some work to do to clean up that pool from which we dip in to get our resources. So talk, talk, talk. We can't talk to each other enough. So everyone, thank you so much for your time this morning. Remember that our next webinar will be on Thursday, July 23rd at 11 a.m. And in that next session, we will have Mr. Kevin Ajoda, security specialist at Cisco, sharing with us the right way to protect remote workers. Thank you. Work from anywhere. Stay safe and stay connected with CANTO Conversations. Have a great day.
Thank you.
Hi, Phyllis.
Hello, Teresa.
Oh,
Bye.